Hello. You have just been reading about the anti-slavery movement in the 1800s. It was one of the first human rights movements that is still active today and unfortunately is probably on the rise with globalization. So we are very excited to have with us KaraSmith, Sr. She's a targeting analyst for Deliver Fund. This is an NGO intelligence agency dedicated to fighting human trafficking, a modern form of slavery. Previously, she served as an intelligence analyst in the Air Force for 6 years and was deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq to track down terrorists. Kara then worked as a counterterrorism intelligence analyst for the NSA and FBI. So welcome, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Would you please tell us a little bit about your work, what you do at Deliver Fund?
Absolutely. So Deliver Fund is a nonprofit private intelligence organization that equips, trains, and advises law enforcement on how to combat human trafficking here in the United States. We work with law enforcement directly to go after the human trafficker so that the trafficker can be put in prison, their victim saved, and then it prevents any other victims from being victimized in the future by that trafficker.
So let me stop you there just for clarification. It's a private organization, or what we're learning are called NGOs, and yet you help the police or work for the police?
We provide them intelligence that assists them in their investigative process. Law enforcement is vastly underfunded and undertrained, specifically with human trafficking. Here in the United States, we have federal agencies that work against gun crime, alcohol crime, drug crime, but there's no one agency here in the United States that specifically focuses on human trafficking. That's because human trafficking is everywhere. It's on the ground. Federal agencies do have agents within Homeland Security and the FBI that work on combating trafficking, but it's the local and state agencies that are really at the head of this fight. And so being able to train them and equip them and advise them, we're trying to make this center nexus for all law enforcement to be able to combat human trafficking together across the nation.
And how bad of a problem is this in the United States?
It's a huge,
or globally, sorry.
Globally, it's a huge problem. In the United States, we don't really think that human trafficking is a problem, or we might look at it and go, oh, well, that's people coming over in shipping containers or Russian brides, and we might look at it as a problem that enters the country. But in reality, human trafficking is happening every single day here in the United States, because human trafficking, in very simple terms, is modern day slavery.
And what does it look like, human trafficking? It's not just Russian brides. What else is it?
So in the United States, when it comes to human trafficking, the two largest forms of trafficking are labor trafficking or domestic sex trafficking. And specifically with domestic sex trafficking, it's when you have an individual that is being forced or coerced to sell themselves for sex, and then they don't get to keep any of their proceeds. It's often guised as prostitution in the United States, but prostitution and human trafficking are two completely separate things. Prostitution is when a person sells themselves for sexual reasons, and then they get to keep all the proceeds of their labor. Human trafficking is when somebody is being forced, coerced, or they're being defrauded to do this act, and they're not being able to keep the proceeds of the labor themselves.
And tell us about the labor trafficking.
Labor trafficking you will see more in the domestic fields of nannies, or people who are being forced to clean homes, people working at hotels, picking crops in fields. We've seen labor trafficking as well when it comes to people being more brought in from other countries in that aspect, and they get tricked into believing that they're coming to the U.S. and they're going to be able to work for themselves, but their captors and the people enslaving them will force them to work and take all the money from them.
Does this happen in New Mexico?
Absolutely. It does
All
happen.
kinds?
All kinds of trafficking happens in every single state that you are in.
And what's the gender breakdown?
The gender breakdown, specifically when it comes to domestic sex trafficking, is between 94 and 96% female being trafficked, as they are being used for sex trafficking. There's also gender minorities and males that are approximately about 4 to 6% of the trafficking victims in the United States.
And what do you do? How do you combat this?
Well, we at Deliver Fund combat this by assisting law enforcement on finding these victims that are trafficked. We look for signs and indicators, and then we take that information and use the online open source intelligence that is provided on these victims and backtrack it to the trafficker themselves.
What does that mean, open source?
Open source intelligence.
Yeah.
It's any intelligence that you can find without having to use a classified means. So the internet, the front-facing internet, is open source intelligence. Here in the US, the domestic sex trafficking industry, they advertise their victims on illicit online websites to the Johns, the customers. So the customers can go order a victim up like it's pizza. And the Johns will not know the difference between somebody who's legitimately selling themselves as a sex worker, as a prostitute, or a trafficking victim. They go on there and they pick which girl they want and they order them up and call them into their house, or they go out to where the victim may be. Now, if you touch the internet, as everybody knows, if you put something online, it's there forever. Well, trafficking victims, when they're put online and their trafficker posts these online ads, they leave a footprint, they leave information. So as an organization, and with the skills that we have in our counterterrorism backgrounds, we are able to exploit this information and build it out further using identifiers and social media.
Wow, and can you tell us, have you had success in your endeavors?
Extreme success. The information that we find online, you can't lie about what you've put on the internet. It's there. So the intelligence that we find and provide to law enforcement is often used in the cases when prosecuting the trafficker. And a lot of these traffickers plead out because you can't lie and say, oh, I didn't post this ad, when your fingerprints are all over it.
The evidence is there.
The evidence is there. So they often plead out if they do go to trial. As of this moment, we are at 100% conviction rate for the traffickers that have gone to trial with the intelligence that we've provided to law enforcement across the country.
So on your website, I've seen that you help law enforcement and train law enforcement, but you yourself also do what? That you do this research, this intelligence analysis of the open source.
Absolutely. So we train law enforcement, but we also assist them in their endeavors and provide them what we would call intelligence reports or target packages. So if a law enforcement organization is going after these traffickers, we help identify victims that are legitimately trafficking victims. We're able to weed out between the legitimate sex workers and prostitutes and the trafficking victims. And then we go, hey, this is where your trafficking victim is, this is who she is, this is her probable trafficker, and provide that intelligence ahead of time so they can go in and act on the information.
And what happens to the victims after they've been rescued, if that's the right term?
That's the correct term, yes. So victims, when they get rescued by law enforcement works with other NGOs, victim services organizations that they have on hand during these operations, and they contact them. Those victim services organizations provide them resources, get them housing, get them education, help them usually detox from the drugs that they may be on, get them counseling and other needs that they might need met. And it's very difficult when these victims are rescued, a lot of the times that they are just so brainwashed and they are psychologically in this very deep Stockholm syndrome, because this is how the traffickers groom them and manipulate them. It's hard for them to what we call outcry. When they do get rescued, a lot of them resist. And it might take several times coming in contact with law enforcement for them to finally reach out and go, please help me. But when they do, those victim services organizations are there.
Let's turn this and connect it to human rights specifically. Would you call yourself a human rights organization?
Not necessarily. We wouldn't call ourselves a human rights organization because we specifically focus on combating human trafficking. There's human rights encompasses so much, but we only focus on the human trafficking aspect of it.
So there is a fair amount of international law against slavery in particular. Does that international law figure into your work or help your work at all?
When it comes to legalities and law and rights of slavery, we decided with the Constitution that slavery was illegal. And it has been decided by the higher courts here in the United States that if somebody is not keeping the proceeds of their labor under fraud, force, or coercion, they are being trafficked, which is slavery. What's interesting is in the United States, if they're over the age of 18, you have to be able to prove in court that there was fraud, force, or coercion for them to do this and the act and the person that is controlling them. But however, if they're under the age of 18, you do not have to prove fraud, force, or coercion. You just have to prove that they were being forced to commit the sexual act or the labor act by their trafficker.
Could you define terms a little bit for us? There's human trafficking. Are there other terms that we distinguish in this world?
In this world, we talk about human trafficking a lot, correct? And a lot of people get that confused with human smuggling coming across the border. Human smuggling is when somebody is being paid to move one person from one place to the other, and that sometimes gets confused with human trafficking here in the United States. When people are smuggled in, they are susceptible to being trafficked because they are much more vulnerable. But that's not necessarily human trafficking, it's just human smuggling, having them come over.
And do you think that we are making progress in this area?
We are absolutely making progress on human trafficking here in the United States, both on the aspect of combating it from assisting law enforcement, but also to the educational side. This problem is huge, but most people in the United States aren't looking at it in the proper way. They don't see it happening, but with our organization and other organizations out there getting a little bit louder and explaining exactly what human trafficking is to the public, it's doing a great service and understanding to what we're doing. And the more people that understand what human trafficking is, the bigger impact we're going to be able to have on a society of abolishing it.
And what would you like our students to learn about human trafficking? Or should I say, how do we fight this as a community?
Can I answer both?
Please do.
So, as students in a college atmosphere and what you're doing, you probably see human trafficking fairly regularly. A lot of victims that are trafficked in the domestic sex trafficking industry, they walk amongst us. They might even go to school here. They might have somebody that's controlling them, and on their off time, they're being forced to sell themselves to make money, and then they might come back to school on Monday morning and you don't even know it, but they're not keeping all the proceeds of their acts. When you're looking and seeing people who might be in trouble, you might see that they might not have control over their funds, over their identification. They might have a drug problem and be reliant on a drug dealer, and that is where they're being forced to go have sex for money and then pay their drug dealer. That is also human trafficking because they are being coerced to do these acts and have to go through these steps to put their addiction at ease. It's happening quite often, and often that most people don't realize that it's happening.
What can we do about it? What can the rest of us do about it? Awareness and education helps.
Awareness and education helps. Don't become a victim. There are traffickers out there looking for vulnerabilities every day. Trafficking victims don't just come from impoverished young adults in the system and teenagers in the system. You can be a middle class, upper class person who has a full ride to college.
Can I ask, what are characteristics that they're looking for in victims?
Yes, absolutely. Traffickers are looking for victims every day. They are the product to the trafficker. It's how they make their money. They could sell their victim over and over again, but in order to do that, you have to recruit your victims and groom your victims. They're looking for vulnerabilities. They're looking for insecurities that they could come in and fill and finesse the victim into thinking that they are their world. So a young girl who has a gentleman that comes out of nowhere, who has seems to have a lot of money, but has no job, or is randomly off in different places, working with a bunch of different people, and then comes back, but really has no job. Seems like they have a lot of influence. They might be very kind and charming, but in actuality, they're running an illicit business. Something that you really just have to think about is, especially as a young female, if somebody comes to you and it's too good to be true, it's really possibly too good to be true. If you have a very robust social media account where you might even be an influencer or you share all your personal details, that's an open window for a trafficker to pick apart your insecurities and see where they might be able to slide in and befriend you and bring you into their life and what they may be doing.
Wow. So in New Mexico, what kind of victims do we have? Might they come from foreign countries? Might they be local?
All of the above. You'll have victims in New Mexico where we've had a victim who was working at a local fast food restaurant, and her trafficker finessed her. She fell in love with him. He love bombed her, and then started getting very rough and saying, "You have to do this or I will hurt you." Got her addicted to drugs, and her only way to get her fix was to make that money and go sell herself for that fix. And then he eventually traded her to another trafficker. And it was that easy. She met her trafficker and thought that was going to be her boyfriend outside of her place of work.
And how many come from out of the country?
A large majority of the victims that come out of country you'll see in the illicit massage parlor business. A lot of the Asian massage parlors out there, their victims perform sexual acts at these massage parlors. So that's somewhere where you will see, here in New Mexico, human trafficking taking place. We've also seen human trafficking taking place where the victims are exploited in restaurants, where they come from a foreign country and they're trying to work for a living and they're holding all their proceeds from them and saying, well, you might not necessarily be here legally. We're going to take your papers unless you continue to work for us. And that's more of a labor trafficking aspect.
And what could the nation be doing better to improve or end human trafficking in the U.S.? At the national level or the government?
The government can fund human trafficking task forces. They could fund them, and they could recognize that the laws are not strict enough. Every state has their own human trafficking laws, and then there's also federal human trafficking laws, but in order to prosecute under federal laws, there has to meet a federal statute. So depending on which state you're in, here in New Mexico, our laws are absolutely abysmal. They will only get a couple of years in prison if convicted. So usually the cases here in New Mexico, we see law enforcement always trying to take them federal because they have a higher sentence. But if you go to Montana, it's a life sentence if you
Big differences.
are trafficking. And that's up to our legislator. So being aware of what the laws are and making them more strict, ensuring that your departments are properly funded, backing a task force, because traffickers go from place to place, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Here in New Mexico, you have different jurisdictions they may cross, and being able to have law enforcement communicating within the task force is extremely beneficial.
Explain what you mean by task force.
So a task force is comprised of multiple law enforcement jurisdictions, whether state, local, and federal. And you take an officer or two from every one of them, and they work together.
Because sometimes they don't talk to each other, and a task force ensures communication.
Exactly, and you'll see that very often that law enforcement departments are not communicating, and that's one of our goals with the Deliver Fund, is that on the human trafficking aspect, that the task force and the jurisdictions are communicating. So an ideal task force in New Mexico would be run by the Attorney General's office, and then Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, Sandoval County Sheriff's Office, the Albuquerque PD Vice Unit, Santa Fe,
would all
Rio
sit
Rancho,
on the task
would
force.
all have officers on the task force. So when something were to happen, they could call upon the task force and be like, we need to go and act on this operation. Can you send me your officer? So that they have the resources to do so in a timely manner.
So this is an example of how to fight human trafficking, a tried and true method that can be spread and should be spread around the nation, is task forces.
Absolutely.
And it is also something that we citizens could campaign for, or policy that we could champion at the legislature.
100%. A really good example of a task force here in the United States is in Houston. It's called the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance. They don't even call themselves a task force. They're a rescue alliance, and it's 22 different law enforcement agencies combined. And when they go out and they do their operations, there is somebody from every agency there working on these operations.
So a trafficker or a victim doesn't slip through the cracks. People come together and say, this happened in my county, oh, be aware, the guy's moved over to this county.
Absolutely.
Or something
and
like
so
that.
when they work these operations, usually the jurisdiction that they are running the operation out of is who's going to prosecute. But if they have a victim that they have seen previously, or a trafficker that may be associated to another victim come in, there'll be a detective or an agent that's working that day on the operation, be like, oh, that one's mine. I know that our DA will be all over this. I will take this case. And so it also spreads the caseload out of human trafficking across the jurisdictions, so that one jurisdiction isn't solely responsible on the caseload itself, overburdening the
If we had a task force in New Mexico, would it make sense for your organization to be at the table?
Oh, absolutely. I work with multiple jurisdictions as it is here in New Mexico, and we're continuously working on bringing in other jurisdictions. I have a law enforcement meeting once a week. Actually, today, we're meeting this afternoon with 3 different jurisdictions coming together to talk about the cases, the trends, what is happening here right now in the state.
How incredibly interesting. Is there anything else that we should mention to our students that would be important for them to know?
Education.
Yeah.
Legislation.
Yeah.
Supporting law enforcement agencies in their endeavors and going after those human traffickers. There's also the ability to look and work with victim services organizations to see if they also need support in the area.
Probably a lot of these things are underfunded, so donations are welcome to organizations.
Absolutely.
Including yours.
Yes, absolutely. So Deliver Fund, we're 100% nonprofit, so anything that we can fundraise from the public is extremely beneficial. Every single cent that we fundraise goes directly to combating human trafficking, and we hold ourselves accountable to our donors.
How is your organization funded?
Private donors.
Private donors?
Private donors. So,
and how did it get started? Who started it?
Deliver Fund was started by our executive director, Nick McKinley, and our vice president, Jeremy Mayhew. Nick McKinley was a former pararescueman in the Air Force turned CIA agent, and Jeremy Mayhew was a Navy SEAL. And what they saw happening overseas, and they saw human trafficking taking place, they were trying to figure out where they were supposed to report it back here to the United States government, and there was no such place to report the information to. And they both decided, like, after seeing such atrocities overseas, especially within human trafficking, that they wanted to do something here in the United States because they knew what was going on here as well, and they knew that there were those gaps between law enforcement of being funded and being connected and being able to report this information. So they started Deliver Fund.
And how did you end up with them?
You know what, it's great. I had my LinkedIn account up and up to date. I was taking a 2-year break from work to raise my children, and my LinkedIn account had my whole career history on it, and it said, hey, you know, intelligence analyst living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and our executive director literally in LinkedIn was looking for intelligence analysts in Albuquerque, and he cold called me, and he got a phone call going, and he goes, do you want to hunt human traffickers? I'm like, Absolutely, I do. So
And
that's
why
how
do
I
you?
joined.
And tell us about your job satisfaction or interest.
I have an inherent need to hold people accountable for their actions, especially illegal actions, especially when they're hurting other people. And I think my whole career with counterterrorism, I've just always liked to go after the bad guys. And when it comes to human trafficking, I didn't know what human trafficking really was until I started this job. But when I found out that it was mainly happening to women and children, and they didn't have a voice. They didn't have anybody there to protect them or hold the people accountable, responsible for making them do what they do. So I do my job because I want to make sure that everybody has a voice, especially within human trafficking, because not a lot of people know what it is, not a lot of people raise a fuss about it, and that kind of is my mission these days, is to stop it and make sure people understand what's really going on.
And yet you are in a long line, a century of anti-slavery workers. So you come from a strong lineage. All right, final question. Can you tell us about your necklace?
Absolutely. So my necklace is the Deliver Fund sigil. And the sigil itself, this horseshoe shape, is what they used to brand slaves in Africa. And they would either have it around their neck or around their arm. And at one point, it was even used as currency on the streets of London, these sigils. And the sigil itself, you can't see it here, but there's a chip in it, and that's for the chip of chipping away at slavery itself. And then the mark across it, it's usually red, and it's to signify all the blood that has been shed in slavery throughout time, for all those that have come before us and given everything to it. And the red dash is also the international sign of distress.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story with us and helping educate us about this current problem.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.